Have you ever wondered if King Arthur was even a real person, or what role Ricimer the Kingmaker played in the quickly collapsing Roman Empire? Well, do we have some stories for you?
This is the AD History Podcast, weaving a tapestry of world history from 1AD to HD. Now here are your hosts, Paul K. DiCostanzo and Patrick Foote.
And brought to you by London and St. Louis, Missouri, you are listening to the AD History Podcast. I am Paul K. DiCostanzo, and I am joined by my co-host, Patrick Foote. What is the good word today? What's the best word, Patrick?
Best word, and the word that's coming to mind, well, words that are coming to mind right now is St. Louis, Missouri, Paul. That's going to take some time to get used to. I'm still like a little bit thrown every time you say it when we start recording episodes these days. Yeah, like I'm like, oh, that's different. But no, apart from that, the word is good, as it always is good, Paul. It's always great fun recording these podcasts with yourself and for all the lovely listeners. How's things on your end of the pond?
Well, my end of the pond is, well, I'm not as close to the pond as I used to be, of course.
No, definitely not.
Now right here on what some might call the Central Coast. But I'm here in my temporary super secret history bunker. Next time around, I should be into the permanent location, which I'm, obviously looking forward to because I like having my proper recording space and everything set up just the way I want it and just be able to flip a few switches and then we're off and going.
Yeah, it's going to be very, very exciting when you get into that new space, Paul. We'll be able to get this podcast back on a whole new level, I imagine. Yeah.
I'd like to think so.
Yeah.
I'd like to think so. But as far as today's episode goes, today is kind of a preamble, a prologue to what many historians considered to be the end of the Western Roman Empire, which in this case would mean in our very next episode. And you are discussing somebody who played his own role in all of this.
A big key player in the fall of Western Rome, I'd say.
Yes, indeed. And we have a fantastic Patreon question, and I'll be doing the latter half in terms of that segment, which we have something that's a lot of fun, and I think you guys will very much agree and understand why. But with all of that in mind and all of it out of the way, it is time to lay down our necessary, obligatory, now legendary AD History Podcast ground rules. 1. Evaluate events in the context they occurred. 2. Over the span of recorded history, the way it was recorded, its methodology, and the facts that are and were important have changed immensely. How we view history today is not necessarily how we viewed it even 50 years ago. 3. Nothing in history was inevitable. And 4. History and the past is like a different country. Patrick, let's talk some Ricimer. Which is to say, Mr. Foote, Sir Patrick, you have the floor.
Let's get on with some good old-fashioned rigmarole, Paul.
Oh boy, that was a gem.
Yeah,
we're off and running today, cooking with gas.
So yes, let's talk about Ricimer, shall we? This is a figure I hadn't heard of before I began researching this episode, Paul. I don't know if you had. I don't know if our lovely listeners had either. But upon researching it, this dude was a big player in the fall of Western Rome. And it's at this point in the fall of Western Rome when we meet this very pivotal figure. That, of course, being the man who we just punned about, one Ricimer. He ruled over Western Rome during this decade, but to call him an emperor or a king, that would be an understatement. He was something so much more. And he earned himself the epic title of a kingmaker.
Now, you listening to AD History, whether this is your first time out or you're a long-time listener, that means usually you're pretty up on things. You're pretty savvy when it comes to things like this in the world. But I'm going to pose the question anyway because it's important if there's, those who are listening right now and you're not familiar with it. And that is, what even is a kingmaker? Which is say, is it at all similar to how we use the term today in modern politics? A well-placed individual with considerable political power and
Mm.
military power. They often seem to go hand in hand in some cases, but is not seeking the top spot themselves.
So it is very, very similar. In Ricimer's case, it's very similar to the modern concept of a kingmaker. He was a dude who got to choose who was king or emperor, we ought to say. He was the maker of kings. He was the king maker. So yeah, it's very, very, very similar. It's just a great sounding title as well.
You know, here's a question I think that is also worth posing. If you're somebody that powerful with such big designs on power,
Mm.
why would you choose to be a kingmaker as opposed to the one who formally is calling the shots?
Well, that's interesting, Paul. There's a huge variety of cases why you might not want to be the one calling the shots. In Ricimer's case, we do seem to have an idea why he didn't want to be emperor king himself, but we'll get to that in a moment. But there's all kinds of reasons why. In Ricimer's case, I'll just have a little spoiler. It has to do with origins and blood and heritage, as these things with monarchies tend to be about.
Yes, and the Romans, as you and I and you listening well know, despite their long time aversion to this, though I think that's really past at this point. Not particularly embracing the title king, but they just simply found other titles. To denote that, which I think is quite interesting.
Well, of course, that goes back to the very founding of Rome, when Rome was an empire. Then when Rome became a republic, king was a dirty word. You didn't want to be a king. That was like the no, no, no. So that's why when it became an emperor, they didn't use king, they used emperor. It was a whole sort of don't say decay word, basically. And we're at a point now where decay word is being said willy-nilly and being applied to the people who rule Rome.
In those early years of the imperial period, they were even more savvy than that. They made sure to call whoever is calling the shots their princeps.
Exactly.
As we've mentioned many times in the show, they didn't start calling the one in charge emperor until about the beginning of the 2nd century. So in this case, Ricimer is going to play the role of kingmaker.
Yes, and
Let's hear more about this.
So one thing worth mentioning when it comes to kingmakers, normally the person they are making king is a stooge, is a puppet, if you're going to be a kingmaker, you're not making someone equally more powerful than you as king. You're making sure someone directly below you in all manner of ways is actually the quote-unquote king. That's something else worth mentioning as well, as we will see with Ricimer. So yeah, even though this is when he starts to do his thing, of course he was born a little bit before that, and we aren't too sure about Ricimer's early years. What we do know is his father was part of the Suebi tribe, and they were a Germanic people, and his mother was actually a Visigoth princess. But that, a few episodes back, or a few seasons back, that would have been, a Visigoth, the son of a Visigoth ruling Rome. But by this point, the Visigoths were so integrated into Roman society that she was basically Roman aristocracy unto herself. So it wasn't as big a deal as it might have seemed only a few centuries or so ago.
I mean, you think about the ethnically Latin folks who have been running the empire for centuries, to be able to see this just so apparently in terms of really what they would have considered an outsider calling the shots, at least in terms of the remnants that exist here in the West. They might have spit on the ground and thrown salt over their shoulder.
Oh gosh, yeah, but she's far, the Visigoths are far from outsiders. They're in with the Latin folk. It's quite impressive, yeah.
Absolutely, it just has kind of taken on its own life at this point.
Just become the norm to a degree. But we start to discover more about Ricimer around the time he joined the Roman army. So what we know for sure is that in 456 AD, he played a large role in ending a Vandal invasion of Sicily. And this was seen as a very good thing, to say the least. This allowed him to rise up the ranks of the Roman army. And it was also during his time in the military, he met Majorian, who was another Roman general. And what's interesting is this Majorian, he'll play quite a large role in Ricimer's life, because Majorian would be the first of Ricimer's chosen emperors when he became kingmaker. But that's all to come in time.
Now, I
Mm.
think the 100-pound question in the corner, or the 1,000-pound question in the corner that sits, at the crux of all of this, given the emphasis of this particular individual in this segment,
Mm.
how exactly did Ricimer become the kingmaker he was?
So, like we've seen so often, we even now use the title of Kingmaker, going back to Wang Meng at the very beginning of this podcast. These people tend to have a habit of like snaking and weaving their way into positions of power.
Absolutely.
And of course, as we've seen in Rome's history so often, through military. So he rose through the military ranks. And as he gained more power in the military, he gained more support. We've been seeing this for centuries now in Rome. The barracks emperors, those guys who had the military behind them and were declared emperor, not by the people, not by the Senate, but by their army. And who's going to disagree with someone who has the biggest army? So it's somewhat of a similar story here.
Well, so long as you can keep them loyal.
Exactly. And it was in that aforementioned year 456 AD that he actually made his claim to being kingmaker. At this time, Avitus was the Roman emperor. A guy called Avitus was the guy running Western Rome. And he was actually proclaimed emperor by the Goths. And this is something that didn't sit well with Ricimer, which is kind of silly considering his Visigoth background. I know the Goths and the Visigoths are two different things, but something a bit strange there. But with the
I
support,
could understand that he might have some issues here
Mm,
because even if they are closer to him in terms of his origin,
mm,
that, or even if they're not, it's very simply just a challenge to his own authority and his own designs.
exactly. Yeah. Um, so with the support and power of the Roman military behind him, he actually deposed Avitus. He did actually spare Avitus's life, however, and this is a strange little bit I found. Like, he forced him to live the rest of his life as a bishop, which is like a very strange punishment. Am I right?
I have to admit, I've never heard of this happening before. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened
Mm,
elsewhere, but I found this outright bizarre, Patrick.
mm.
Just outright bizarre. And did you find out any of the thinking that went into this? I mean, is there something in his background that would have led him to the conclusion that this is the right move?
So, in my actual research, no. Thinking about it, I could perhaps see it as being something of a like sparing a life did not seem too evil, potentially. Like, if I kill him, that might lose me popularity. But if I let him live out the rest of his life as a bishop, I still get to be in power, and I don't seem all that evil in the aftermath of it. That's one theory from myself. I can't say if that's true or not, but no, during my research, nothing actually really came out about it. Because what also happened is Avitus actually died later that year from unknown causes. So we don't even know how the dude died. So we probably have no idea why he was sentenced to be a bishop. Maybe he was still one of Rome's pagan emperors or something. Or I imagine at this point he was a Christian.
No.
Yeah,
That's not happening anymore. That hasn't happened for a long time now.
But maybe secretly or something, who knows? But no, like, it's a strange punishment, if we can even call it a punishment, I suppose. Maybe it was a parting gift, a goodwill gift here. You can't be emperor, but you can at least go be a bishop still.
Yeah, I can imagine there's definitely the politics of presentation and perception going on here. It certainly might make him look like a more even-handed and wise figure to say, okay, I'm removing you, but I'm not going to kill you. At least, at the very least, considering we don't know anything about his fate in terms of how he died. So anything we say is mere speculation. But it also, if you really want to take a cynical tack to this, which I do.
That's the tack we always take.
It might have been wise to get him out of public view and out of public mind. And when that happens, being able to off him behind closed doors when nobody's really paying attention.
Yeah, that's good potential. I say he died from unknown causes, so maybe he was murdered. Who is to say?
But yeah, that is just the ultimate skeptical theorization. So just treat it as that, because we don't know.
No, we don't know. But of course, what we do know is that Avitus died later that year. So whether he was a bishop or dead, that doesn't matter anymore. He's gone. This did give Ricimer true power in Rome. But he didn't become emperor. He instead gave the title of emperor to his friend, the aforementioned Majorian. So now we get to that whole question about why Ricimer didn't just become emperor himself.
Yes, this is definitely something I want to get some more insight on.
So it's interesting, despite how I was saying how being of Visigoth heritage wasn't as big of an issue, it still seems to have been a big enough issue to stop him from being emperor. It was like his position in power was already heavily debated, tenuous, and fought against that time. So not only having him be emperor, but having him be emperor and not fully Roman was just felt to be a stretch too far at that time. Of course, this is a stark difference from the plethora of non-Roman emperors we've seen so far, but that was the Barracks years, that was the Christ the third century, anything go then. I mean, we're not in much of a better situation by now with Rome, but they seem to have some sort of dignity about, no, we have to have someone properly Roman as emperor. So that seems to be the issue here.
Something that we're beginning to see more certainly in the East, and right now, chronologically, where we are in the show, you can call the Eastern Empire the Byzantines at this point for all intents and purposes.
They didn't want the name association with the rest of the Roman Empire at this point.
No, they were kind of just becoming their own thing, even though, Emperor Leo I still most certainly had interests and designs in the West. To what extent he was ever successful there is very much debated, to be sure, and really depends on how generous you wish to be. But in terms of the religious issue, we're well past the paganism stuff, but what has replaced it is, what kind of Christian are you? Are you an Arian or are you Orthodox? Yes. And that's something that ends up being really, really important in the Eastern Empire for the Byzantines. Like, right off the bat here, happening simultaneously. So they have the religious matter and how it fits politically, because the two very, very strongly are intertwined at this point. You can't have one without the other. Love and marriage. You get the idea.
Totally.
So,
yeah.
I mean, that's kind of interesting in terms of why certain individuals might choose to be kingmaker and basically pull those strings from behind the scene for someone that's slightly weaker. But that is also a very dangerous thing to do, because there may come a time, and once again, in the East, this has actually happened with Emperor Leo I, who was put on the throne to be a puppet, who eventually ended up turning on his benefactor and, basically asserting far more of his own will, agenda, and policy. And that ended up being very messy. But in this case, it seems like Ricimer has been fairly diligent, fairly well-focused on trying to find the best puppet possible.
It does appear that way, doesn't it? And he actually got through quite a few puppets, to say the least. And as we mentioned, that first one was Majorian. So Majorian was emperor, putting up some bunny ears for the camera there if anyone's curious why I'm saying it like that.
Yes. Yes.
Majorian was emperor from 457 to 461, which of course gets us into the area of today's episode. He was the first of Ricimer's chosen emperors, and he's actually seen as a pretty good emperor, and some sources even claim him to be Rome's last great emperor, which is a title we've seen happen so often now, the last great emperor of Rome. So this is very much one of the very last ones. And despite how he came to power, he did actually genuinely want to fix Rome. He put an end to tax abuse and even wanted to reclaim lost land. He especially wanted to reclaim North Africa for the Western Roman Empire from the Vandals. And Paul,
we've talked about delusions of grandeur at this point. I know,
right? We've talked about before just how valuable North Africa was to the Roman Empire. Egypt, Alexandria, the breadbasket. It was a hugely valuable, symbolic place to Rome, and they've lost it since now. That's the Vandals, and spoilers, Majorian ain't getting that back.
Well, here's the interesting thing about the North African situation, is the Vandals, as I understand it, controlled an area that was roughly west of Cyrenaica, and that didn't go too far into the North African interior. While the Byzantines at this point, or the Eastern Empire, whichever you fancy at this point, but I can tell you almost certainly from this point on, we're just going to start calling them the Byzantines.
Oh, God, yeah.
they still control Egypt.
Oh,
But
do
the
they?
Vandals,
Okay, then.
they do. I was looking at a map the other day, and I said, "Oh, well, that's kind of interesting, isn't it?"
Mm.
But no, you look at the map of the empire in this decade in particular, and it is just, given his aspirations, just leave one to think, "Oh man, guy,
Mm.
come on now. You don't have the resources, you don't have
No.
the power. You were brought in to never really have the real power.
No.
It's not happening. The Vandals are pretty well entrenched there. You're lost so much of the Iberian Peninsula, large portions of Gaul, and then you have the East, which is now more or less going and doing its own thing.
Mm.
So you hear about those ambitions and you say to yourself, oh boy,
Yeah.
there's God bless you. That's pretty much all I can say.
Ancient Rome to me, Western Rome right now to me, it makes me feel like a washed up actor, like the kind, and this is why I sound a bit mean. The kind you kind of see at a comic book convention who no one wants a signature from, like, hey, remember me? I'm the Western Roman Empire. I was good once. And everyone's too busy to get signatures from like, the new, young, sexy Byzantine Empire or something.
Yeah, basically, the kid that played the young Anakin Skywalker.
Oh, I've forgotten his name, but poor kid.
Yeah,
Jake Lloyd.
Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
Lloyd.
Why is that knowledge in my head?
It's because it is so your milieu in general, and it's a lot of mine as well. But credit to you for getting it off the top of your head. Yeah, pretty much kind of like the Jake Lloyd of things.
The Jake Lloyd of ancient history. Where were we with this? So, yeah, as I was saying, Majorian wouldn't reclaim any of Northern Africa. And this was for a lot of reasons. As you said, the resources weren't there, but also he was betrayed by others in his army who didn't follow his order. These commanders were instead in the pocket of, you guessed it, Ricimer. So, despite choosing Majorian to be emperor, Ricimer wasn't happy with what he was doing. He was being too autonomous. He was doing too much of his own thing. Ricimer wanted him to be a puppet, and he was being far from a puppet. There are no strings on me, we might be tempted to say.
I'm listening to how Ricimer is acting. To me, at least in kind of a more classical sense, not as in the classics or the classical period or study of classics. But you understand what I mean at this point. Ricimer almost seems to be operating like a mafia don.
Totally.
In terms of getting all the people he wants in a certain place to make them in some way reliant upon him, including their position. Like a big political boss that we had, say, in the 19th and early 20th century here in the United States. Or if you want to go farther down the road of legal malfeasance, he's the Don, as it were. But while he is in charge, all those who, formally, nominally hold that power, he has them picked very carefully, and boy, they don't have a very long leash, do they?
No, not at all. And when they do try and get a long leash, he yanks them back in. He didn't. So yeah, Ricimer didn't enjoy the changes to Rome Majorian was making. Ricimer wanted Rome in his pocket, and Majorian was giving power back to the people. We don't want power with the people. We're way beyond that here, Rome. So Ricimer conspired with his fellow aristocrats in Rome to sabotage Majorian's plans. And Majorian returned to Rome with a weakened army, and Ricimer forced him to abdicate. And a few days later, Majorian, this guy who Ricimer put on the throne to be the face of Rome, he was executed and his body was dumped in the river. So, not off to a great start with Ricimer, to say the least.
That mafia analogy is taking on so much more weight and substance now.
Well, it is Italy we're talking about, I suppose, aren't we? The home of the mafia.
Organized.
We're not the
Rome
home,
did
but
have.
yeah.
I remember once looking up. I'm not looking to deviate too far here. I actually did at one time look up organized crime in ancient Rome, and it was a thing.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I mean, maybe someday we'll play with that a little bit. But I remember doing that a couple of years ago for a few reasons. And I was surprised what I found. But in this case, this is very public facing, to be sure. the whole idea of giving Rome back to the people. What people?
Exactly.
Back to the people.
Who is this? Who are these people? Like, what even is Rome at this state? It's a little more than just a concept, to say the least. It feels like,
You know,
yeah,
if you're under in some long reach way distance under the effective control of Ricimer and whoever he's putting up in these positions. If you believe that, I have a suspension bridge that I want to sell you that connects Lower Manhattan to Brooklyn. Just a thought.
I like that one. Yeah.
But do go on, my friend.
Sorry, yeah. So this meant Ricimer, of course, had to find another emperor. Even though Majorian was gone, Ricimer was still kingmaker. So he found someone by the name of Libius Severus. And you can notice we're already starting to run out of names here. We've had a Severus many, many, many years ago on the show. This emperor isn't quite the same as that Severus.
Yes, the Septimius Severus.
Yeah. Not as well remembered. So Ricimer made someone named Libius Severus emperor. Very little is seemingly known about this Severus and his origin. And despite the fact he reigned for 4 years, he actually seems to have done very, very little. And unlike,
shocker!
Who would have thought, unlike Majorian, he really was a puppet to Ricimer. So Ricimer really liked this guy. He was actually a puppet. Hey, you will do what I want you to do.
A genuine meat puppet.
But what's really interesting about this one is just how many people his reign annoyed. This Severus's reign was disputed by pretty much everyone and anyone. This was kind of seen as Ricimer taking the piss a little bit of his king-making capabilities. The Emperor of the East at the time was like, hey, that guy shouldn't be emperor. The military commanders in the Western Empire are like, yeah, that guy who shouldn't be emperor. There was so much backlash over the appointment of this Severus as emperor that Ricimer actually had to intervene. Severus died in 465 AD, and we aren't entirely sure how, but poisoning by Ricimer, once again, those organized crime roots are creeping in. That's a popular belief. The most popular belief is that Ricimer had to deal with the backlash of putting this guy's emperor, that he got rid of him via a little drop of poison.
As far as poisoning goes, obviously this is something we've been doing for a long time, and well past this. One of the, and I say this quite ironically, and a little bit darkly to be sure, quite macabre. One of the funny things and interesting things about assassination by poison is that it allows the guilty party to have more than just a little bit of plausible deniability. Because they're not sitting there with a spear or a dagger or a sword. No, just a bit of poison. You put it in the libations, whatever it is that they're drinking, and then everybody could say, "Oh, what happened? He got sick and he died." And you can play coy. And basically, there is no hard evidence, unless there is hard evidence. But for the most part, it does give you a lot of plausible deniability.
Am I imagining things? Or is there actually a kind of poison with a very similar name to Ricimer, like ricin? Does that come back from my Breaking Bad roots? Yeah, just some.
Yeah, ricin. That was kind of a red herring, as I recall. I haven't watched Breaking Bad in quite a while, but yeah, ricin made a notable appearance.
Ricin, Ricimer, there's kind of a similarity there. That's just me working with names, Paul, as I tend to do.
Yeah, I think Walt. I think he ended up poisoning a kid. Hey, that show has been out forever. If you're worried about spoilers at this point, wherever you may be, if you're interested in it, shame on you. That masterpiece has been out for a long time. Yeah. Spoiler warnings are out the door.
But yeah, go watch if you haven't already. But no, we've got to carry on. So Ricimer had to find himself another puppet emperor to rule over while he was too busy being kingmaker. And this brings us a gentleman by the name of Anthemius. And he reigned from 467 to 472 AD. So Ricimer's puppets have worked their way through the entirety of this decade. What's interesting is this one actually wasn't chosen by Ricimer himself. Anthemius was instead chosen by the Emperor of the East, one Leo I, who I think we might be hearing a little bit more about in due course. Am I correct in saying that, Paul?
Well, we'll see what comes around.
Leo got a say in who became emperor as something of a make-good after the heavily disputed Severus we just mentioned. Anthemius was also the son-in-law of the previous Eastern emperor as well, so a bit of nepotism going on there as well. Leo also wanted someone in the West on his side in attacking the Vandals of North Africa. So he wanted an ally, he wanted family. It was kind of just like a try and get a position about on the throne of the Western Empire for the Eastern Empire, the Byzantines at this point.
A lot of blood and treasure were spent trying to adequately deal with the Vandals.
Exactly, yeah. This is just more of that. So Ricimer was in a tight spot, and he actually accepted Anthemius as his emperor. Ricimer's only accepted this on one condition, that Anthemius's daughter marries Ricimer himself. I don't know how old Ricimer was at this point. I don't know how old Anthemius's daughter was at this point, but it's probably not the strangest marriage we've covered in Rome thus far.
No, but I think I can have some understanding of why he may have wanted to do this.
Oh, totally. That's like rule 101 for dynasties trying to intermix and be on good terms, marry off people.
Yeah, exactly. Try to connect them through marriage and family. But it's funny that despite how many times that has been undertaken in history, just how often it fails as well.
Yeah, like it doesn't ever really seem to go all that well.
If you're going into it thinking that, oh, well, now we're connected by family, they may be more inclined to cooperate and we can work towards potentially mutually beneficial ends. All I can say to that is, have you ever been in the middle of a family dispute?
Exactly. Yeah. Have you ever been around like a Thanksgiving table or something? I haven't, but I've seen films where that does happen. Yeah.
I was about to say, that is ironic coming from you. But yes, that's a very accurate thing.
Families tend to make people butt heads more than bring them together in some ways, it feels like.
At times.
But something interesting with Anthemius, speaking of those sort of marriages not going well, his time as emperor didn't go too well either. He was seen as basically being another lame duck. His attack on the Vandals resulted in a devastating defeat for Rome, and with that, Anthemius's popularity waned too. He was Greek and a philosopher, and many actually, we were speaking about this earlier, many actually suspected he wanted to bring back paganism to Rome. Which it's just a theory, as we mentioned, Rome is firmly Christian at this point. So yeah, any whiff of the old gods, no good right now. So in 472, he was actually found in hiding and beheaded. So once again, even though Ricimer didn't get the chance to pick this guy, he didn't really prove to be that good either. I think it's safe to say.
Yeah, it really didn't pan out, and that's part of the danger.
Oh,
being
totally.
A kingmaker.
At this point,
because you do risk your own reputation and power in becoming a kingmaker. If either A, they don't work out, and you don't have the political clout to be able to handle the fallout, and if you don't, you might very well go down the drain with them.
Well, like how many abdications of royalty have we seen throughout history? Like most of the time, it's a job. Being king or emperor is a job for life, depending on how long that life is. And at this point in Rome's volatile history, towards this end game of Rome, for lack of a better term, because that's where we are right now. We're really getting towards
Western Rome's end game.
Yeah, we are in Western Rome's end game. It's not going to be a good time being an emperor right now. This isn't the time. You're not getting your Trajans or your Claudiuses or your Augustuses. Like they're not happening right now. We're bottom of the barrel in regards to Roman emperors. And
that crop is over.
Speaking of bottom of the barrel, we actually arrive at Ricimer's final puppet emperor, that being Olybrius or Olybirius, one of the two. He reigned in just 472 AD. He was a wealthy Roman placed in power by Ricimer, and he was also married to Ricimer's niece. So once again, we're seeing that connection between family and marriage, getting people in people's good books, in theory anyway. But what I enjoy most about Olybrius, This is from his Wikipedia page. Of course, take it with a pinch of salt, as we always have to do with Wikipedia. When I was researching for this guy, not much was coming up more than that. And this is an actual quote from Wikipedia. They refer to his reign as short and uneventful.
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely. It sounds like a nice afternoon picnic in length.
totally right. Get to be emperor about 1,500 years ago. Do sod all. Get yourself a Wikipedia page and a bit in the history books. Not too bad going that. Not much seems to really have happened under him. Like short and uneventful, for lack of a better term. He became emperor in July of 472 and actually died in November of that same year. So what's that, like 4 months, if that? 4 or 5 months? You think I should know this? I've lived through enough years.
It's close enough.
Yeah. But someone else died in the August of that year during Oliberius's reign. That, of course, being Ricimer himself. How Ricimer exactly died, we aren't too sure. But somehow, which is quite different to the rest of Rome's rulers thus far, he wasn't executed and he wasn't murdered. He seems to have died of natural causes, and sources point to either a hemorrhage or a stroke of some kind. But without Ricimer pulling the strings, Rome was left without a kingmaker, and hell followed shortly after that. Because you might be thinking, yay, he's gone. We don't have someone pulling the strings anymore, like guiding things. We can be our own people. But Rome was in such a dire state at this time, Paul. I'm sure you know that they really needed, for good or bad, they needed someone with any sort of modicum of power and control to do something like that, because Rome wasn't in a good spot right now.
Both the nature of the universe itself and the nature of humanity, as I've said several times on this show, abhors a vacuum.
Mm-hmm. Yep, history.
Yeah, and God help those who have to live through that vacuum.
And Ricimer left one hell of a vacuum. He's a really divisive figure in history, if you couldn't tell by now. He is seen by some as being the first nail in the West's coffin.
Really, the first?
Yeah, one of the many, I guess. One toward like the real get thing going, because obviously after him,
like the final players that make the House of Cards collapse.
Exactly. Though we will see how things without him we will see that things do take a dramatic turn without him. So if I had to describe Ricimer as anything, it would kind of be like a flimsy bit of duct tape on a very much sinking ship. Maybe quite a good bit of duct tape, but that's the last bit of it. He was the last bit of duct tape, basically. This is a strange analogy.
Yeah, I mean, more or less another analogy you could use is he was the one and truly the last one that had an effective finger in the dike.
Yeah. Yes, that's a great way to put it. But there's actually one last claim to fame about Ricimer, which I found personally interesting because it's something I've been quite following throughout a big part of this podcast. He was the final emperor of Western Rome to rise up from the military. So after him,
even though he was never an emperor.
You're very correct there. Even though he wasn't technically emperor, he was the last leader of Western Rome to rise up from the military.
He was the power behind the throne.
Caught me out there. Well done. After him, no emperors or leaders of Western Rome came into power through military might. And this does truly put an end to the Baroque emperors, which started all the way back in 235 AD with Maximinus Thrax, I believe his name was. But we're finally at an end of that point for Rome too. Which
250 years of this, just on and off.
On and off, of these military men trying to claim power over Rome. And that can really be seen. When we talk about when Rome fell, like, it wasn't one event. It started falling since Commodus. Like, it's been a downhill spiral since then. There's been some up points. There's been Diocletian, who helped get us out the Christ of the 3rd century.
But we obviously had Aurelius, who put it all back together a couple decades before him.
I forgot his name for a moment there. But like, it's easy to just see the fall of Western Rome as this one thing. And doing this podcast, one reasons we do this podcast too is because we're students of history just as much as we're educators of history.
Yes.
And to
Presenters
of history, and to see that downfall happen in pretty much real time. It's been so fascinating. We're not there yet. I think the next episode or so, as we mentioned earlier, that's when Rome's really going to go kaput, Western Rome anyway.
Beautiful, as always, Lord Foot. Us here, you there, and we'll be back right after a word from one, Anna Domini.
This is the AD History Podcast. Keep up with the show and join the discussion by following AD History on Twitter with the handle @ADHistoryPC and the hashtag ADHistory. Check us out over on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube by searching AD History Podcast, as well as, of course, tgnreview.com/ADHistoryPodcast. Also, check out the AD History Podcast on Patreon. See how you can help support the show and the rewards that await you by exploring the AD History Podcast on Patreon. See the link in the description. Now, back to Paul and Patrick.
And thank you, Anna. And folks, your ears are not deceiving you. You are hearing that music. And that, of course, means we're in the patron-submitted middle segment of today's podcast episode. And of course, if you want to submit a question for us to answer in this middle segment, please do consider becoming $5 a month or more up Patreon over on the AD History Patreon, patreon.com/AD History. There'll be a link down below. We supremely appreciate anyone who donates over there. You help out the podcast in a huge, huge, huge way. But Paul,
Here.
Here indeed. We've got a really interesting one today. And it's something that really comes quite close to heart, I guess. It's something we're both very, very passionate about. And the question is, how and why exactly did you two both get so deeply interested in Soviet history? Paul, this is something we're both very interested in. It's been a running theme throughout this entire podcast, our interest in Soviet history.
It is interesting.
So I was saying you are definitely much more of a student of it than myself. I have an interest in it, but you are a true bastion of knowledge when it comes to Soviet history, Paul, that I could only yearn to be.
I hope not to disappoint.
No. Maybe I overhyped it a little bit there.
This is interesting. I would say, actually, just in terms of our own personal history, this is actually one of the periods in history you and I initially bonded over, which is interesting.
Totally, yeah, no.
So this is an interesting question, especially given modern current events that's going on. And the one thing I'll say off the bat is, obviously, you nor I endorse what's happening right now in terms of what's happening over in Ukraine. However, having a knowledge and a deepening knowledge and understanding of the Soviet period is critical in many ways to understanding the Russia of today. Not because the Russia of today is out there trying to spread international communism. Those days are over. But like today, like the Soviet period, like the Tsarist period that preceded that one, they have very similar geopolitical instincts. But the one thing I'll say about this is that, for all intents and purposes, this knowledge and this understanding and this study of it has been very useful in understanding what's happening with a bit more clarity. So I just want to get that out of the way.
No, definitely, Paul. Knowing Russia's history immensely helps in the understanding, as you mentioned. I'm just going to reiterate what you said, Paul. It helps immensely in understanding why Russia is the way it is today, all warts and all.
But to really answer the question, this actually goes back to being a kid. And I remember my mom showing me for the first time the film adaptation, the 1965 film adaptation of Boris Pasternak's famous novel, Dr. Zhivago.
Gosh, how old were you at this time, Paul?
5 or 6.
That's a hell of an age to watch Dr. Zhivago for the first time.
Yeah, and I'm not going to pretend that I particularly understood it, but there was something about the film that spoke to it as a keenly different time in a place where the conventions that I'm only first learning as a kid in my own life in the society I live, that was very different than my own. And, in this case, it's interesting because you have Omar Sharif as Yuri Zhivago, the protagonist, And in the movie, you also have, and this is going to be interesting because most people, this is not their introduction to this actor.
Mm.
Having his half brother and member of the Cheka, and then within the scope of the novel, the NKVD, his half brother Yevgraf, played by one Alec Guinness, who doesn't have much screen time, but he does a good deal of narration in the movie.
Alec Guinness is such a... I don't know if underrated is the word. Star Wars...
hardly underrated.
Not underrated, but what he is most known for doesn't do his career justice. He is he was a terrific actor. And
unfortunately, he knew that.
Yeah. Yeah, and Obi-Wan was like the cherry on top of his career, but to the wider public knowledge, it's become everything about him. But he has got some amazing stuff. Go watch some Ealing comedies, which he starred in, many of them. Terrific actor. And it's great to see he was in Dr. Zhivago as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're at all familiar with the novel Dr. Zhivago, and when it came to Pasternak, he took a lot of heat when he tried and published this. And basically he lived in a situation where, you know, it brought a lot off on top of him. And it had to actually, for it to be published in the West, apparently, I remember hearing stories that the transcript for the novel quite literally had to be, you know, snuck out of the Soviet Union on like napkins and whatnot. So it's that's quite a tale to be sure. And, you know, he has so many wonderful contemporaries of that time that are quite like Vasily Grossman, of course, Life and Fate, things of that nature. You know, these are guys that are very much there with their Russian predecessors, like Dostoevsky or Tolstoy. They all very much fit in their own way into that interesting canon. And so that's really where it started for me. Obviously, I didn't pick up the novel version of it until a very long time after. And even then, it's not an easy book to read because Pasternak just goes through so many various diminutives in terms of names. Sometimes it can be a little hard to follow. But that's kind of where it started for me. And obviously, the whole World War II element came into it as well. I'm curious, where did it start for you?
So I'm trying to think back to my earliest kind of memories. And I think, quite frankly, Russian history has been part of my life. This can sound very, very, very pretentious, but Russian history has been part of my life ever since I can remember. My dad is extremely into Russian history. Finds it deeply
That's interesting that it's both came from a parent.
Exactly, yeah. But I
never knew that.
No, I genuinely think he said, maybe jokingly, that he thinks that in a previous life he was a Russian peasant during the Tsarist regime or something. My dad is deeply fascinated by Russian history, Russian culture, like Tolstoy. Everything and anything Russian he will devour. So it's always been a factor in my life. It's always been a very common thing, having books of Russian history, having Russian history sort of shared with me, being sort of pointed towards it. Then I remember once again in school, I had a history teacher, Mr. Osborne, and he was also a Russian history nut. You get these people who are just deeply into Russian history. And I had three, including yourself, Paul. I have like three key players, a father, a friend, and a teacher in my life who've all been obsessed and deeply fascinated by Russian history. And my teacher, Mr. Osborne, he even looked a bit like Gorbachev to a degree.
Oh boy!
Yeah,
without the port wine birthmark.
Minus the birthmark, he even looked a little bit like Gorbachev. Remember, he would quite regularly come in a red tie with the hammer and sickle on the bottom of it. He was like, his big gimmick was being into Russian history. So for me, it just comes from it comes from a plethora of just figures in my life, and it's just always been there. I've always been aware of it. And this is going to sound a bit silly as well, but we're talking about Russian culture. And that includes things like art and music. And we mentioned Tetris earlier, which you didn't even know was Russian. That's one of Russia's finest cultural exports, Tetris.
I never knew that. What can I tell you?
No, But something that comes to mind for me, I think one of my earliest memories of being like, oh, that looks cool, I want to know more about that. Soviet propaganda just looks amazing. Like,
Yeah, that socialist, what they call socialist realism is the style.
It's
it has a very, it really imprints on your mind in a very palpable and permanent way.
It's just, I think I remember seeing like pictures and posters of old Russian propaganda, communist propaganda posters, and just being like, that looks really fun. I want to know more about that. That looks cool. Literally, little more than that aesthetically looks cool. I want to understand what that is. And I think a big part of it, like my 14-year-old brain at that time, kind of just drifted towards it for that reason as well.
Yeah, and when you're 14, you're not really thinking about it in a greater context. You look at it, and you are, without a doubt, somebody, especially visually and in terms of your illustrations, somebody that's extremely artistically minded. So I could definitely understand how you could see a poster like that and be taken with the aesthetics of it, because whatever, for all intents and purposes, socialist realism does have this very intriguing quality to it.
Yeah.
If you're evaluating it purely on the aesthetics, not the political side of it, but the just pure aesthetics part of it, it can't help but capture your attention.
Those stark reds and whites and yellows. If I ever get the chance in a YouTube thumbnail or a YouTube video, I always like make sure. I did a video recently about countries called like the Socialist Republic of North Korea, like the Democratic People. These countries, these
Democratic People's Republic of Korea,
and
DPRK.
I made sure to give that like a stark Soviet realism design to it, because like, if I only get a chance to use that kind of aesthetic, I'm going to use it. Going on a little bit with why you are interested in not only Soviet history, because even though the question mentioned Soviet, with Russian history in general.
And that's definitely more our wheelhouse, but yeah.
It's primarily because Russia has a incredibly fascinating history as a country, as a nation. Like, all countries have interesting histories in one way or another, but the absolute roller coaster that Russia has been on from being a Tsar, even before being a Tsarist regime, when it was separate states. I think it was Ivan the Terrible who might have brought it together.
He ruled basically medieval Muscovy back in the 16th century.
And he was kind of one of the first ones to kind of unify Russia into one single concept, kind of what led it on to the path it was up until like to the Tsarist regime.
He was rather, if I recall properly, he's a very close predecessor to what we would know today as the Tsarist dynasty, the Romanovs. And Alexander Romanov, who I believe was the first of the Romanov Tsars. And, that period lasts 300 years. Good gracious. And they have their giants, and they also have their footnotes in terms of those that were ultimately the Tsar. But for me, that's the initial touchstone, but it kind of went dormant for a while for me. And it wasn't again until I got back to my adult years and I had more of the tools of various kinds to really be able to invest myself and dive deeply into what the Soviet period was all about and the various elements of it which I find most interesting. Because the Cold War is, you got to understand the Soviet Union if you want to understand the Cold War in its entirety.
Funnily enough, I was just about, once you were done talking, I was going to mention the Cold War, because the Cold War is a personal favorite, like, to study in history. It's one of my favorite events, most fascinating parts of history to look into, because there was so much going on. It's so deeply linked to the Soviet Union. So I think there's another reason I'm so interested in Soviet Union history, because it includes Cold War history, which was just an incredible, bizarre time in the world, which we were kind of the aftermath of it, Paul. Like, we kind of came, by the time we were about, it was kind of done and dusted, and we were living in this, what we didn't realize at the time, a freshly post-Soviet world.
Yeah, so it's interesting because, you think about the Second World War, and that's only 6 years, and only 6 years.
No, totally, yeah.
60 million people died in that. But then you look at the Cold War,
So long.
and you think just what's 6 years to 4.5 decades?
Yeah.
And so, and it's such a global thing. You can never truly study everything you want to know or need to know about the Cold War, depending on how deep you're looking to go, because the scope of it is almost endless.
It was a state. Sorry, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, it was absolutely a remarkably high stakes endeavor for both sides. But obviously, when it comes to Soviet history, there's also, and this is hardly a surprise to you, the longtime listener, there's, of course, the Second World War part of it, which there's no extricating the Soviet contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany in particular. They obviously had their role in the end with Japan, but primarily they're the ones that put up the bodies and did the hard fighting, did the oceans of blood. And that's not to discredit the war effort of the Western powers, which cannot be undersold. But reality, it was the oceans of Russian blood that broke the back of the Wehrmacht. But also, when you're looking at Soviet history, for me, once again, not going to be a surprise. I've always found of these enormous, in terms of their impact, figures, the totalitarian dictators, in this case, two of which are definitive despots. You can't understand what happened in Nazi Germany and with Hitler without understanding also what's happening in the Soviet Union and with Stalin. And for me, once again, you, the listener, if you are a long-time listener, know that I have a very interesting fascination with Stalin. Not because I endorse him in any way. No, so
you definitely don't endorse him.
Or have any sort of affinity for him. But if you do the numbers and you stack them up against each other, Stalin, both personally and as a despot, to me personally, is a far more intriguing figure than, say, Hitler is, because he's a lot more complicated, and in many ways much harder to understand. It's probably the best way that I would describe it. And so naturally, I would say the thing that really did skyrocket, especially the Stalin part, is having discovered, naturally, Stephen Hawking, who I have mentioned so many times on this show is absolutely silly.
I think you sent
me... Going back literally to the first episode.
I think you sent me, when we did that special update video about Ukraine when that first broke out, you sent me over a couple of his talks, and they were incredible. Like, he knows... Not only does he know his stuff, he knows how to explain it in a very easy to understand way, which I appreciate.
Yes. Which is incredible for somebody that is now a professor emeritus at an Ivy League institution like Princeton. What I'll say about this is one of the things I like about Hawking outside of his work is, for me, he's a very familiar figure insofar as this is a guy who grew up in the Bronx, going, in the 60s and, eventually ending up in university in the late 70s, early 80s. So he's a personality and a voice that is very natural to me, because I've heard that voice and disposition in so many people that I've known throughout my life growing up in the shadow of New York City. And I remember there was this one part, I think it was volume 2, Waiting for Hitler, where he called one of the subsections of one chapter 3-card Monty. And I thought to myself, yes, I have met folks like him before. It's one of the things that really evoked it. So yeah, you're absolutely right. He does make it very easy to understand, but at the same time, in making it easier to understand, he doesn't revert to simplicity. He does it in a way where you're understanding the very important, complicated aspects of it that, are very important, but in a way that anybody who's interested in paying attention can really grab onto and hang a lantern on, which I think is great. And, that, and for me, just anytime, especially if you're doing something like 80 history and the way we do it, and we've taken many different tacks and approaches to this now over the years, for me, there's nothing that's really quite as interesting especially, as the political scientist in the room, then understanding how power is inherited, built, exercised, established, and to that end,
and transitions, I think,
certainly that. But in terms of just accumulating so much power and consolidating it effectively, despite the tremendously odious nature of that regime, there is essentially there's very, very few that can measure up to how much power Stalin accumulated and the way that he did it. And to understand that can give you very fascinating insights into politics in many other places that don't share that same kind of totalitarian despotic system. And he was a despot because as we go back to the first season, I think, when we had J.J. McCullough on, we were talking about Domitian. We were talking about the difference between a dictator and a despot. And when you have a dictator has not, everything he says does not necessarily, his word doesn't necessarily prove law, because there are still various fiefdoms and various supporters within that make that rule possible. But once you're a despot, you've consolidated all of that. So the way Kakin describes the Soviet system is a dictatorship within the dictatorship, which is absolutely a stellar way to understand the nature of a despotism, right? So that came up, I think, sometime in the last 15 years when it began to reemerge. And once you go down that rabbit hole, everything else eventually ends up coming with it. That, and just at the very beginning, just as we did at the start here, Patrick, going all the way back to being a kid, and I'm not pretending to understand it when I first saw it, but that Dr. Zhivago, seeing it for the first time, and though I didn't understand it given my age, it was still clear that this was a very different time and place, and that captured my imagination as a kid. And then, of course, getting older and studying it more in depth. And, of course, there's a very big difference between understanding it and endorsing it. A lot of people make the mistake that colloquially, when somebody says, "Oh, I understand," it means I both I both comprehend and also give you the thumbs up. That's not the case at all here. You simply want to understand it. You don't like it. You don't want to do it, but you want to understand it. And that's very important. It's been very important to me.
Something I'm curious to ask you about, Paul, and something we can talk about as well a little bit. I'm really into Soviet history. You're really into Soviet history. We mentioned there's many other people out there who are just as fascinated by Soviet history. And we've talked about the reasons why we are so interested in it. Do you think that's the same for everyone else? Like, what draws so many people into the history of this nation? Like, it's really got a sway on historians. So many people are fascinated to know more about the history of this country, especially during the Soviet period.
That's actually a dynamite question. Obviously, I can't speak for anybody else, but so this
curious,
is purely speculation.
What's going on in Russia that makes so many people fascinated by it?
If you're living in the West, it's so foreign. The way life got on in terms of how society was structured and how the system worked and what came out of it is very different in so many ways than what came out of the West from countries like yours as well as mine. And to understand the people who went through it, and also understanding, and this is really important, this is both true of the Soviet Union as well as the Russia of today, how that entity was populated with so many different ethnicities and religions and their own unique histories that contribute to the greater picture of what's going on. In addition to the fact that, like I said, you can't really understand the Russia of today without understanding that Soviet period, even though they're very different in a lot of ways. But all I can say is because in some ways it's alien. And so in it being so different, there is this quality to it that makes it very intriguing to learn more and to try to understand it. And how did people truly go about their everyday in such a scenario? I think Ronald Reagan probably put it best, though, when this is when you started seeing that slow melting that eventually allowed Reagan and Gorbachev to work with each other. Reagan was giving a very famous speech about if, two Americans and two Russians, a couple, both being parents, a John and Jill and, and Oleg and Anya were to be sitting at a bus stop together and strike up a conversation, what would they be talking about? Would it be challenging each other over, each other's various political systems? Maybe, but not altogether the most likely outcome.
No.
They would talk about their kids. They talk about their lives. They talk about their jobs. And for me, at least, I can only speak to myself, is that while the system was vastly different and the geopolitical conflict so immense and so dire, is that they're still human beings, no different than each other in the most basic and important ways, fundamentally, yet finding a way to live and find happiness in the world that they were in. And on top of that, now I think one of the reasons why Soviet history has become even more interesting to a later generation beyond its existence is now we have so much more information about it. Because before things really started getting nasty between Russia and the West for various reasons that we have absolutely no interest in discussing right now. We've been there, we've done that, you can find it. That's not for today. Before things got particularly nasty, we had access to the archives.
Yeah.
That allowed wonderful historians, like Stephen Kotkin, for example, to really begin seeing the details about what's going on. And on top of that, and this is going to go back to the Second World War thing, Patrick, the story of the Soviet Union during the Second World War is, to me, endlessly fascinating. Just the realpolitik of it and how all the sides were kind of playing with each other, even though they had the same nominal goal of who they were looking to defeat in cooperation with each other. I mean, that's what it is for me. And, to understand a totalitarian system or authoritarian system going forward, you also have to understand how they developed in the past. And where do you see the warning signs and what do you do about it? Because, living and growing up in the West, we have very specific conceptions of how we want to live and how we think government should be run. And this is not a political treatise by any means. This is a very practical question in terms of what's happening where and why, and being able to see those remarkable examples from the past to understand what might be happening somewhere and where and when and why. None of us can be identical. Mark Twain, of course, said, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. That's one of the reasons that it's so important. And at least that's where it all comes from. What are some closing thoughts in terms of your interest in this? Because this has been an interesting question. I didn't really expect it, but here we are.
So I guess my closing thoughts are, I just notice it's such a common reoccurring theme across many people I've met, whether that be in person, whether that be online. There's just this deep fascination in Russian history and Soviet history. I remember when I went to Berlin, obviously Berlin isn't in Russia, but once upon a time, of course, East Berlin had deep ties to the USSR. And sort of like the gift shop sort of people on the sides of the street, they were selling like communist hats, like communist commander sort of hats with the camel and sickle on it because of the ties to that. And people were buying them. I went on a school trip and people in the school trip did buy them because there's just a weird draw to that part of history, that political party, that era of time has this deep draw on people from all walks of life, whether that be just like with me, because it looks cool, whether because of the truly fascinating history and the people from that land, or because of the culture as well. Like we mentioned, Tchaikovsky, Tolstoy, Tetris, the amazing things that have arrived to us from the land of Russia. I'm just deeply fascinated by the draw that country has on people. And I'm interested. We're probably not alone in this, Paul. So I was wondering if we could throw it to the listeners. Maybe we could ask them to explain if they are Russian nuts like you and I, and what drew them into their interest in Russia. Maybe we could read a few out in the next episode.
Absolutely. And I think the best way to do that is, of course, if you're watching and listening over on YouTube, please leave it down in the comments. We want to know what you have to say. In addition to that, of course, you can tweet it at us at AD History PC on Twitter, Facebook.com/AD History Podcast, Instagram, where Instagram.com/AD History Podcast, or you can even email us at adhistorypodcast@tgnreview.com. Once again, that's adhistorypodcast@tgnreview.com. And once again, this was our middle segment. And if you want to have one of your questions answered in the middle segment, something about the show, something come up, something we've covered, history in general, or something regarding Patrick or I's professional life, all in play. And if you go over to patreon.com/ADHistoryPodcast, if you are able to donate on the $3 a month or higher, you will get new episodes 48 hours early, the Salacious Director's Cut, and a great deal more. And we cannot thank our patrons enough. In addition to that, if you're looking to make a one-time donation, you can do that at PayPal. We leave a link, especially over on YouTube to be sure. And we'd like to thank our patron for submitting this fascinating question today. And us here, you there, and we'll be back right after a word from AD.
This is the AD History Podcast.
And thank you very much, Anna. Now, Paul, your segment is very exciting today because it's about a figure very much synonymous with my country, the strange island I get to call home. In fact, it might be quite possibly the most legendary figure from this country, pun intended. So, Paul, I want you, and I'm going to try and do my best to fill in some British blanks with this one, but I want you to tell me all about King Arthur. And something I've always wondered, did he actually exist?
Well, now that is the question now, isn't it, Patrick? And this is very much a reversal of roles between you and I, because this is the first time I've handled anything that takes place on the island that you call home.
Yes, yeah, I guess so.
Known as Britain. And all I can say is maybe it's a bit of a do-si-do after covering the Americas in early season 2. But we'll have fun with it all the same. But did Arthur exist? That's the interesting question, isn't it? And long story short, the evidence is scant, at least as we understand Arthur today. So, with that, Mr. Foote, I think it is best to set the scene. There are few in the annals of Western culture that habitate such a sweeping space as one King Arthur. Indeed, we are talking about a true celebrity of sorts. But notice I have yet used the word history to describe Arthur, or the acts attributed to him by others. The, quote, once and future king, close quote, of what we know today as Britain is absolutely integral to even the modern national story of his alleged life and deeds. If I'm correct, his story is even depicted on the walls of the British Parliament at Westminster Palace.
That sounds true. That sounds about right.
It would seem to fit. But yet again, we return to that unused moniker of describing Arthur in any true historical terms, which then, of course, begs the question, did Arthur even exist? Truly a loaded historical conundrum, as any we have explored prior. But before we go on, because I'm curious about this, to what extent has the legend of Arthur affect your experience living in Britain today? Obviously we have Monty Python, but
Yes.
how have you been exposed to this? What did you learn, and even how familiar are you with the general story of his life?
So, from my own memory, I can't remember ever being taught about Arthur in school. I'm sure I was. I'd be very surprised if I wasn't, if we didn't do it even like in elementary school, as you guys would call it, like junior school. I'm surprised it wouldn't have happened then. Primary school, whatever you want to call it.
Primary school,
Yeah.
elementary school, it's all good.
I'd be surprised if it wasn't mentioned in some capacity, but I have no memories linked with Arthur in an academic sense coming top of my head. I've researched Arthur off my own back. I think I've even Googled this question myself of does Arthur even exist? I think I've Googled that myself. He's, as I mentioned, he's probably the most well-known of legendary figure the United Kingdom has to offer. If you were to think British mythology, probably like behind St. George and the Dragon, you have the legend of Arthur and Excalibur and the Knights of the Round Table and Camelot. And many places claim to have been Camelot, where Camelot was located, or even the Round Table. So if you go to most parts of the UK, you'll find something relating to the legend of Arthur in some capacity. I believe Winchester, a city here in the UK, which was the capital for a spell. I think after Cromwell, I think some royals went to Winchester and claimed it as the capital. I'm not entirely sure on that one. But the Round Table.
After Cromwell, wow.
Yeah, I think the Round Table can be found, or the supposed Round Table can be found in Winchester, hanging up on a wall for everyone to see. So it's kind of everywhere, but also nowhere. Like, that's the best way I can explain it. Arthur's impact is everywhere and nowhere. In the modern UK, in the UK in 2023, we're not all walking around thinking, oh, God bless Arthur anymore. We're too busy thinking about another king at the moment, evidently. But,
yes, indeed.
But we all know the story. We all know the broad strokes, whether that be through Monty Python, through, there was even the Merlin TV series a few years back. I never watched it myself, but it was like a prequel series to Merlin and how he became the wizard he is today. It was kind of the BBC's fantasy Doctor Who for a period.
Okay.
I don't know how popular it became around the world. I don't think it quite had the impact Doctor Who has had, but it was like,
not.
It was their attempt to make the story of Arthur and Merlin into a sort of more palatable way. So everyone knows it. It hasn't affected my life in any huge ways, but we all kind of know the broad strokes of Arthur, I would say.
That's interesting because definitely over in the United States, that this tale through cultural osmosis has worked its way into cultural imagery, especially when you're referencing something. Like, for example, calling something Camelot, that very much denotes being in a golden age. Things like that, or the various acts attributed to people that were around him, things of that nature. However, I would bet dollars to donuts, Patrick, that there are very few among us, even though we're familiar with Arthur, have ever really heard the meat and bones of what that story entails. There are different adaptations to it. There are different details to it. However, this is the general outline of the Arthurian legend. As I mentioned, there are countless variations of the following story, but here's more or less what you need to know. Arthur's alleged father, Uther Pendragon, is a king who is deeply smitten with the wife of the Duke of Cornwall, which is an adversary of his. And her name is Igraine. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that even remotely correct.
I think your old English pronunciation is probably no better or worse than mine.
Okay, so long as we're playing on a level playing field. With the help of Merlin, I think mortal yet supernatural entity, because he's often depicted as a wizard, but we'll get to that. He uses his shape-shifting changeling powers to change Pendragon's appearance to that of Ingraine's husband, the Duke of Cornwall. And Pendragon basically dupes her and copulates with her. She thinking that, she was making love to her husband, when in reality this was a whole, kind of gross affair when you think about it.
Yeah.
Which led, obviously, to the conception of Arthur as an illegitimate son. Shortly thereafter, Merlin makes off with the conceived, or depending on the tale, toddler Arthur. Moreover, Merlin has designed that Pendragon would lead a knights round table of 150 members. So a lot of this has to do with Merlin's acts and deeds and all of this. He's very hands-on, let's say. Quite handsy. When Pendragon dies, this Knights Round Table is vexed as to who should replace him, because as I understand it, he was basically calling the shots because he was a king. He got to be the head of the Round Table. And Merlin informs the body that they will know their new leader by the one who is able to pull the legendary sword Excalibur from the legendary stone. There are many who tried to yank Excalibur from the stone, yet they all categorically failed.
And that is undoubtedly the part of the story everyone knows most.
Without a doubt. Then comes our friend Arthur, in servitude to his stepbrother Sir Kay, who is dispatched to replace Kay's apparently broken sword. In this task, Arthur encounters the aforementioned Excalibur in the stone, and manages to pull it out. He is completely ignorant of Merlin's proclamation, and is proclaimed king.
So one thing I forgot to mention, you said in my personal experience with Arthur, I have a very obscure childhood memory of being at my grandparents' house and watching Disney Sword in the Stone on VHS. And I remember it just being a very strange film that kind of went all over the place, but enjoyable nonetheless. But that's the only time I've ever seen Disney's Sword in the Stone. But talking about that kind of just brung that back into mind for me.
I thought something might slip loose here.
Yeah.
After this, he obviously is proclaimed king. And Arthur, among what feels like his countless deeds of valor and honor, most notably is credited for kicking the Saxon ass to the curb. In doing so, one Arthur generally unites Britain in the process. And this part is interesting because it speaks to a certain attitude at the time, because as you and I have discussed prior, sub-Roman Britain was very well noted by three new occupying forces on the island. Of course, they're the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes.
Mm-hmm.
Or Utes, I guess, depending if you're speaking German.
Yeah.
Leave it at that. Anyway, so he manages to generally unite Britain. In total, Arthur does seem to get into some rather high-stakes activities, aside from the whole mammoth task of defeating the Saxons and uniting Britain, especially when it comes to the quest of finding the Holy Grail, namely the chalice Jesus is believed to have drank from during the Last Supper, and Saint Joseph caught the last drops of Jesus' blood as he died on the cross. Rather big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Arthur did not recover the Grail itself, but it is a subordinate of Arthur, Mr. Foote, Sir Galahad, who does so due to his purity of heart. Touching, really.
And that's, of course, one Michael Palin in the film, for those trying to keep track of those sort of things.
Very good. King Arthur also marries one Guinevere, or Genevieve, or however you want to pronounce it. She's the daughter of the King of Scotland. But once again, Merlin makes his way into the picture and cautions Arthur against this otherwise foolhardy course of action, because Genevieve is into one Lancelot, not Arthur. This goes as well as you'd imagine, as Genevieve has an affair with Lancelot, and once Arthur gets wind of this, Lancelot flees to France, and Arthur chases him in hot pursuit.
So going back to the British perspective and all this, I would be highly surprised if your average British person on the street knew about this love triangle going on in the Arthur legend. I think most people know about the Sword in the Stone, the Round Table, Camelot. They'll know those broad strokes, as I mentioned. But I was taken quite back. I didn't know there was a whole Lancelot, Arthur, Genevieve love triangle going on with all this. And it's definitely, that is something that I think your average Brit probably wouldn't be able to clue in on.
And I am sure that Disney's Sword in the Stone was, eager not to touch with a 10-foot clown pole. Anyway, while Arthur is in absentia across the channel hunting down Lancelot, Arthur's no goodnick nephew Mordred attempts a successful coup. Talk about Roman influence, am I right?
Happened all about the right time. Everyone's cooing everyone.
Yes, they are. It's in fashion. It's been in fashion for a while. Taking the throne for himself. And Arthur returns to Britain and tries to reclaim his rightful throne. After a terrible pitched battle, Arthur is gravely injured and countless of his loyal knights are slain. He then slinks off to the mysterious Isle of Avalon to heal his wounds, waiting for the time to return and save his nation in the future from great peril. The end. So here's the question. You kind of mentioned this previously. In terms of just the story I gave you, how many people really could have actually told you that story in a categorical fashion, similar to what we heard in the very bare bones outline?
Oh, I've never heard that complete story, Paul. I don't think I've ever been taught that by in school. We were never taught that sort of full story of Arthur, and definitely in things like media, not really told about that sort of to a full degree. So no, I'd say not many British people would be able to go into that much detail about King Arthur's story.
So, what of this is true? What happened? Who existed? Okay. And the fact of the matter is, when you go into the nitty gritty of how we got the tale I just gave you, I think you'll find that it is rather similar to how the Homeric epics kind of coalesced over time. So the Iliad and the Odyssey, where Homer is the last in a line of bards that are telling the same general stories, of course, but he kind of brings them in together into something that is more cohesive. But it's something that evolved over time and is undoubtedly influenced by many different things and many different people over a long period of time. We're still trying to, put our finger down on exactly where Troy was located.
Yes, yeah.
And there are some candidates, I believe, a few very likely ones in Turkey, but we're not talking about Homer.
No.
But that's the idea that's going on here. But let's give a little historical context of what we're actually dealing with. And one thing we seem to find with frustrating regularity is the historical hole that sub-Roman Britain represents from the kind of historical method that you and I employ, which is we really, really like basically histories that are written by sources that are recording things contemporaneously as they are happening, because even though obviously it's a subjective thing, taking that all down, it's still somebody who's doing it from living memory, and if you're lucky enough, might have actually been able to witness all this stuff that was going on. But the story that I just described definitely represents at least a certain attitude that would be common from sub-Roman Britain. In addition to that, something you may have asked yourself listening to the show so far is, well, why is he talking about Arthur now?
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, because that's something I was thinking. Yeah, like he's much more linked with the Middle Ages, the medieval time. And this is, even at a generous case, this is the early Middle Ages, if that.
Well, that's the thing, is that a lot of the notable writings about Arthur that we would be able to identify in the modern age occurred in the High Middle Ages. But, and I cannot emphasize this enough, but they are talking about a figure from sub-Roman Britain that would have, if he existed, be have been born somewhere between the mid-5th century, which of course we are in right now, or somewhere to the mid-6th century. But because he is such a figure that has so much mystery around him, I don't see any particular reason why you should choose one time over the other based on the facts as I understand them.
Yeah.
But it definitely reflects an attitude of the native Britons to the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes who are showing up on their island. Now, whether it be that Arthur or anything/anyone else, there simply isn't many contemporary sources like I mentioned. It is also a time of tremendous turmoil in Britain, where native Britons were not necessarily that fond of the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes making their island a new home. In short, it wasn't a great time to be living in Britain, nor is it the easiest period for any historian to grapple with due to the distinct lack of contemporaneous sources. When it comes to Arthur, anyone who is putting his alleged story to paper was doing so literally centuries later. We've heard this story before, but fragments did emerge from stories originating more early on. But let's get to the High Middle Ages here, because that's really the most important part. But well, actually, as a matter of fact, we'll actually start with we'll touch on a little bit of the Welsh mythology and folklore, which is known as the Mabinogion. Now, my Welsh is far from perfect, so bear that in mind.
Mabinogion. I think you did pretty good there.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I take that high praise. Praise from Caesar. The earliest references to Arthur can be found in Welsh text, particularly the Mabinogion, a collection of ancient Welsh stories. These tales, composed and transmitted orally, include fragments of Arthur's story, such as his battles and his association with figures like Merlin and the magical Lady of the Lake. I didn't mention the magic Lady of the Lake before, but it's not so important. That's not one of the huge details here as far as I'm concerned.
I was wondering where she played into all this.
There's also some definitive early Celtic influences that seem to get overlooked, especially when you do some more detailed archaeology in Britain. So when it comes to Arthur's legend, it would appear that not nearly enough credit is given to the influence of Celtic culture of the 5th and 6th century, or the ones that had survived even from prior to Roman rule that still managed to make it past Roman rule, and has contributed to Arthur's story. But here are two such salient examples. I think you'll find these interesting, Patrick. So the whole concept of pulling the sword from the stone is not terribly unfamiliar to how iron blades were fashioned during the period of Arthur's supposed life.
How interesting.
Yes, indeed. In terms of how it's pulled out when it's done, there's some good stuff out there on that, which is kind of neat. It's also kind of hard to explain because I don't know much about ancient weapons. Even though that I know that they were very effective at killing people, and that's what a weapon should be, or at least harming them or dissuading more violence. Good gracious. The other practice of discarding swords. Now, I didn't mention this in the big shakedown of his story, but this is important. And in this case, that is the discarding of swords into a body of water, as Arthur did towards the end of his rule. Apparently, they are still finding large and intact swords in rivers and lakes all over Britain ever since that are largely believed and are dated back to this period and before.
Gosh, I better go put my hand in some rivers and see what I can find.
Well, it might be worth your while.
Yeah.
So the idea of when he got to the end, even though I didn't mention it in the big shakedown of the story, is one of the major things he did was, of course, toss Excalibur into a body of water. And that's something that comes from ancient Celtic traditions, and we have archaeological evidence of this sort of thing happening. But when we're getting to like somebody who's actually trying to write a history here, albeit centuries down the line, probably the guy you can't get around more than any is Geoffrey of Monmouth. So now we actually have a named source that we can begin looking at. And basically, he wrote about the 12th century, like late
Yeah.
12th century.
This is, I
mid-12th
guess, where
century.
people start to get the idea of that's when Arthur's story took place.
That's because a lot of the influences are coming from this time.
Mm.
And so, indeed, the general version of Arthur's story that I gave earlier is indeed a product of the Middle Ages, which more or less corresponds to the writing of one Geoffrey of Monmouth and his History of the Kings of Britain, or in the very nice Latin name, Historia Regum Britanniae.
Fantastic.
Doesn't that just roll off the tongue?
Great stuff.
It is amazing. This was in about the 12th century, as I mentioned, about a good 8 centuries, give or take, following the supposed life and deeds of Arthur. And to Monmouth's credit, he was genuinely trying to construct a history that would have at least passed the sniff test during the period in which he was writing. But this is not where Arthur's tale begins to take on its more saucy flair. Not too long after, like I'm even talking about a few decades, we run into a fellow known as Cretin de Troyes, who was writing in France. He wanted to take a crack at the Arthurian stories because he was influenced and inspired to do so due to the writing of Geoffrey of Monmouth. The only thing is, Geoffrey of Monmouth was very much trying to cobble together a history with the best sources that he had, but that's not what de Troyes is doing. Not in the least. So here's where the aforementioned saucy origins of Arthur's tales originate. This occurred somewhere in the 1860s to the 1160s and to maybe the 1190s. He was inspired by the work of Geoffrey of Monmouth, and in doing so added a whole chunk of the tale we know. Namely, his works ended up leading to the inclusion of Lancelot and Percival, as well as the inclusion of the search for the Holy Grail, which was not part of Geoffrey of Monmouth's tale, as you can imagine. This is where the influence of French Romanticism of the age took its turn in molding the Arthur story we now know. It's strongly the product of prominent themes found in French romantic literature of the period, where things like the Reconquista and the Crusades, Western Europe in general, especially with the nobility, had become more infatuated with courtly and chivalric, kind of ritual. Not ones that would have been terribly familiar to the period in which Arthur supposedly lived.
No, it's so interesting how those sort of the sensibilities of that period have been placed onto Arthur, who lived way, way before anything like that. Like, we're studying what Britain was like at that time, and it wasn't the medieval land we know it as today, but Arthur's image has been very much placed in that time due to the people who have recounted his tale so famously.
Absolutely. And I think, to me, it's actually kind of fun tracking this, seeing how this thing is being influenced and how the story is emerging. To me, this is definitely kind of the historian's dessert, despite the fact that we don't have as many original contemporaneous sources as we could possibly want, which is to say basically none.
Do you know who it reminds me a little bit of?
Who's that?
St. Nick.
Huh?
We've talked about St. Nicholas before.
But he definitely existed.
Oh, he did definitely.
But the same ideas are definitely at play here.
Yeah, like other cultures, and that human has been sort of placed into different locations, different time periods. There's been a lot more extreme with Saint Nick because he's literally become a completely different Sorry, not fictitious. Santa Claus is real. Apologies, no, sorry, I got confused there. Santa's real as well, but he's a completely sort of different figure has come out. But it's kind of a similar story where if you actually tell people this is the real St. Nicholas, they'll probably have that same reaction. Myself and probably many of the viewers are having to find out the more historical accuracies behind Arthur as well.
That is actually a ridiculously good comparison here. Now,
thank you.
The next thing, thank you. The next thing we're going to look at is something that is known as the Vulgate cycle, also known as the Lancelot Grail cycle, or the pseudo map cycle, or the Vulgate cycle, whatever the hell you want to call it. It's a series of French prose romances from the 13th century. It expands upon the story of Arthur and his knights, emphasizing the adventures of Lancelot and the great quest for the Holy Grail. Because, well, if you're writing in this period, boy, talk about material.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah.
This cycle, comprising texts like the Lancelot Grail and the Quest of the Holy Grail,
Yes.
became one of the most extensive and influential sources of the Arthurian legend. So France is still,
Yeah.
or at the very least, French Romanticism of that period in the Middle Ages
is shaping, so much of this
the high
ancient
Middle
history.
Ages, as they call it. Yeah. These are anything but Dark Ages.
Yeah. No, definitely not.
Anything but Dark Ages, to be sure. The next person that we need to talk about here is Sir Thomas Malory, who was writing in the 15th century, so much closer to today.
Yeah,
and Sir
in the
Thomas
grand scheme.
Malory, in the grand scheme of AD history, in the grand scheme of human history, it's not even a nanosecond in geological timescales, but you know what? Humans don't live in geological timescales. But it's interesting to think about. However, Sir Thomas Malory compiled and translated various Arthurian tales in his work, La Morte d'Arthur. Very saucy title.
Yeah.
This seminal text brings together multiple narrative threads, including the Sword and the Stone, the Round Table, and the tragic love triangle of Arthur, Genevieve, and Lancelot. So Malory is bringing it all together here. He might very well be our Homer for all intents and purposes. At least that's the way I like to think of it. Malory's work became immensely popular and has had a lasting impact on how Arthurian legend is understood and interpreted even to this day.
Yeah, that sounds so close to the Arthur. It's amazing seeing the story of Arthur and the broad strokes evolve so much as you went from source to source. By Thomas Malory, he's the one, as you mentioned, he kind of compiled it all together. You mentioned Homer and the Odyssey in that way, someone who took various bits and scraps and kind of compiled them together to make one cohesive story. It reminds me also a bit of the Brothers Grimm to a degree as well, I'd say.
I like that.
Just
That's
a little bit
good one.
Compiled and made canonical versions of the stories, whether they be true or not. It's just fascinating stuff. But that doesn't really answer our main question, Paul. Did Arthur exist? Yes or no?
Oh, a yes or no question. So, the audience is gonna hate me for this. But did Arthur exist as we know him?
Oh,
that's very unlikely.
Yeah.
That's very unlikely. Are there candidates as to who he might be? Yes, but we're not entirely sure who they are, and they're unclear enough to the point where I don't feel even comfortable mentioning them. But I will mention, and this is something that I believe would make most listeners of Welsh origins, if indeed you are listening to us and you are of Welsh origin, especially if you're living in Wales today, because Welsh pride is a very real thing. Very, very, very prideful. Rivaling even us Americans in that regard. And the Scottish and the English. They're very prideful people.
Yes.
Anyway, it is very likely that a lot of what we know as not a lot, but certainly a point of origin, a point of genesis, is likely referring to some kind of warlord who controlled Wales, or the area we know roughly as Wales today, during sub-Roman Britain. And that is interesting to me.
So what I always find so interesting about British mythology and legend is just how much of it comes from Wales. Wales is the smallest home county, home country, whatever term you want to use, on the island of Great Britain. It's the second smallest population-wise, just behind Northern Ireland in the entire United Kingdom. But so it has such a resoundingly strong cultural identity, and so much of what is so deeply linked with Britain, especially from a mythological level, derives from Wales. Things like Arthur has strong ties to Wales. Things like George and the Dragon has strong ties to Wales. St. George, obviously, talking about there. Hence why Wales have a dragon on their flag. Even like St. Patrick Some of the myths place him to being a native Welshman himself. And of course, that all comes from the fact that Wales remained independent from Rome, was free of Roman rule for a much longer length of time than the rest of what would become England would be. So had more time to flourish, achieve its own cultural identity. Of course, Scotland did that tenfold by never getting ruled by the Romans. But it's just fascinating that despite being a small area of a small island of a small country, has such a deep cultural impact on our planet today. And I find that amazing. I'm not even Welsh, but I'm showing my Welsh pride. I have no Welsh ancestry at all in me, but I think it's a wonderful place. Yeah, as far as I know, yeah. I've definitely got Irish roots, hence the name, but the Welsh, I'm not too sure.
As an American, I know from experience that most of us don't really understand the relationship there in terms of, well, Wales is its own country, but it's also part of the United Kingdom, and how it's distinct from England and how it's distinct from Scotland or Northern Ireland or whatever the case may be. and since we don't really understand the relationship there or the relevant history or the culture and, the distinct pride that the Welsh possess, for us, it kind of gets lumped in with everybody else on the island, which is deeply unfortunate, but not at all surprising, because there's not an ambiguous relationship. Here, let me ask you a question. I understand this is a slight deviation, but I have to know, why is it that on the Union Jack, England and Scotland, and I believe Northern Ireland, are represented on the Union Jack, but Wales is not? Why is that dragon not on the Union Jack?
So as cool as it would be if there was a big Union Jack on the flag, the reason that hasn't happened is because at the time, have you seen the original, I think it's the 1771 Union Jack? So it's the pre-Northern Ireland Union Jack.
Yeah, I can make the distinction between the two.
It lacks the diagonal cross of Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
That was the original Union Jack flag, and that's the distinct combination of England and Scotland. And that's because at the time, England and Scotland came together to become the United Kingdom. Wales was actually technically a principality of England. It was its own thing. It wasn't its own thing, I would say. It was not its own thing. It was just part of England at that time. And that's why we had the Prince of Wales. It was kind of like in the same way you had like Duke of Cornwall, Duke of Edinburgh, a title, and Cornwall and Edinburgh are parts of, Cornwall, Edinburgh's a bad example, but Duke of Norfolk, we'll go with that one instead. How we had these sort of dukes of royal titles go to parts of England. That's why we had a Prince of Wales. Well, it was just someone to go to be a representative to represent the power in England. But no, that's a massive tangent to this already tangent. Wales, when the Union Jack was formed, Wales was already part of England. So it is represented on the Union Jack through the English flag. It was only after that flag was formed that Wales became separate from England. But we just never updated the flag to reflect that fact, I suppose.
I wonder why that is.
I think so. The representation of flags is very different in the UK to it is in the USA, I imagine. Like you can't.
Yeah, we're very flag heavy here.
You're very flag heavy, and that seems to be a cross political thing potentially, that it doesn't even seem to be a point of contention. I don't know myself, obviously.
It's pretty bipartisan in many ways. You have to be of a certain persuasion to object to that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Most people, because it's so ubiquitous in this country in terms of putting out an American flag, it's pretty outlandish in many cases when somebody outwardly objects to, especially if they're a fellow American. One is because if you choose to do that on private property, namely yours, it's nobody's goddamn business.
Exactly.
But we are flag heavy. That's something it's very much part of the American identity. I think maybe in a way that is not so much for you. I know for Europe, it definitely is not. Germany is very much the other way.
Yeah. And so here in the UK, flag pride is very much associated with a specific kind of political identity, and having flags everywhere it might be changing somewhat. I know other parties are trying to say we should have flags more, but so whatever the case, what I'm trying to say is that regardless of your opinion on the displaying of the Union Jack, it's a gorgeous flag. I think it's one of the, like, from a vexillological perspective, I think it's wonderful looking. I wouldn't.
It's stunning.
It is a stunning flag. I actually this is purely from a vexillological perspective, not a political perspective. I preferred it without Northern Ireland. It looked a bit more even and clean, I think, personally.
That is a version of the Union Jack that most Americans ended up
yes, not liking,
fighting
I
against.
imagine. Yes, yeah, of course it is. But I'm not saying not in a political, purely from a vexillological perspective. I actually prefer that version, but I think the Union flag is a thing of beauty. And as cool as dragons are, I can't imagine.
Remarkably well designed.
Yeah, I can't imagine any way to integrate the Welsh flag into the Union Jack that wouldn't improve it, or most likely make it worse. But you're right, there should be.
Just something I noticed.
Yes, totally.
It's like, where the hell is this thing?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is technically representative of England because Wales is a part of England.
Got it.
When
got
that
it.
flag,
All right.
when it joined up, but no. As much as I think it would be cool to have a dragon on there somewhere, I can't imagine it looking too great.
Well, so answering the question, did the Arthur, as we understand him through that tale, historically exist? And the answer, of course, is very, very unlikely to have been the case. It could have been any number of southern warlords that were that cut up sub-Roman Britain into various kingdoms in that sub-Roman Britain period. I think there's pretty good reason to believe that it is definitely from the Welsh. But really the thing that I find so interesting about this story really boils, and this is where the historical significance of it comes in, is because there's a lot to be said about the stories we tell about ourselves and the genesis of the civilizations that we create. And over time, this story has had a lot of different influences from other parts of the West, and even through time and cultural osmosis, to an extent, also very much works its way across the pond in many respects, even though our tradition of monarchy is kicking it out. So, to me, I find it very interesting in that way, in that what are the stories that we tell about ourselves, and that the legend can be far more powerful and far more telling about a people's than the best of, really kind of the history that we choose to do. And in this case, this has been very fleshed out over time. And it also speaks to the influence between, the cross-channel influence between Britain and France and Britain. Two countries now, the nation state, which has only existed for maybe a couple centuries, really. These two powers, which, today comparatively have much better relations than they did in the Middle Ages, or, a lot of time after, you get past the Renaissance and, basically up to the Crimean War, where they go really from very staunch rivals in the best of times to what is today, of course, a much more cordial relationship forged through shared struggle, things of that nature. A couple of world wars where you have each other's backs. That usually does help fuse the people, to be sure. And just in general, how it has permeated the legends of Western culture and those stories that we tell, and how various parts of it come in. Like, for example, it is incredibly interesting, at least to me, that Christianity found its way into this thing.
Yeah.
Because there is obviously, we know there's a definitive Christian presence in sub-Roman Britain. And that you have these authors through the Middle Ages who then bring in really salient imagery and important thematic elements in regards to the life of Jesus and Christianity, and making that also part of Arthur's story, which in a way gives him a certain celebrity, even in a theological sense. So you're not just looking at a legend of a country or Anglo-Saxon civilization. And I'm sure, based on what we know, the whole idea at that time of Anglo-Saxon civilization, these folks are freeloaders to what we think of today as Anglo-Saxon civilization. And the stories that are still held close in one way or another, because this story has permeated so much of our popular culture. And I find that fascinating. I really do.
Yeah.
So if you want the answer, did Arthur exist as we understand him? It's very unlikely he did. But the story of how we got the story we have today is just as interesting, if not more interesting, than the idea that an Arthur figure is, one of several, basically Southern Britain warlords.
Yeah.
Who are trying to figure this all out and basically determine who controls what among themselves. And that is what I have for you today, Patrick.
I absolutely adored him. That was refreshing, getting a bit of a British history lesson myself. Thank you very much, Paul, for sharing that with me.
Well, thank you for being part of the civilization that is responsible for it. I just love all the contributions that are made to it from across Western culture.
It's to a degree, it's that classic heroes, like that, not the classic hero's journey, I suppose, but a sense of like a hero. You don't really go further back than Arthur, I suppose, in many ways.
Well, I have not read Joseph Campbell's work in terms of the hero's journey, but undoubtedly, this is one of those things that would really fit in many respects in terms of how he structures the stories in regards to how the supposed hero makes it from A to B. Because Arthur starts from nothing. He rises to the challenge, and he basically comes back around from somebody that's coming from nothing to the guy, and the guy at the right time in the right place, and finishes off the circle. And that is what I have for you today, Patrick. I'm glad you mentioned Joseph Campbell. I wouldn't have thought about that. But yeah, I think it actually does conform pretty well to that. But the idea that the legend and the influences that created it literally span from what we know today as Wales, literally all the way out to the Middle East. That's bloody cool.
That is pretty darn cool. Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Paul. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Us here, you there, and we'll be back right after a word from Anna Domini.
This is the AD History Podcast.
Well, that does it for us today. Patrick, where can people find us?
You can find me personally primarily on Instagram at NameExplainYT. But you can also find me on Twitter at NameExplainYT, and of course on YouTube search NameExplain. What about you, Paul?
In addition to my usual work at TGNR at tgnreview.com, you can find me at my Twitter handle at PKD in History, as well as my reader-submitted World War II Q&A column, The World War II Brain Bucket, where I answer all World War II related questions, which if you are on YouTube, we will have a link down in the description.
That's all today from myself. Goodbye, thank you, and take care.
Yes, thank you all so much. Until next time.
Like all good things, we come to an end for today. Thank you for listening to the AD History Podcast. It is listeners such as yourself who make this show possible and truly awesome. Be sure to follow and subscribe for upcoming AD History Podcast episodes, available wherever podcasts are found. Also, follow AD History on social media. Follow the show on Twitter at the handle at ADHistoryPC, as well as on Facebook by visiting facebook.com/ADHistoryPodcast and Instagram as AD History Podcast. In addition to liking and subscribing on YouTube by searching AD History Podcast. Do you have a direct comment or question for Paul and Patrick? drop them an email at adhistorypodcast@tgnreview.com. Also, be sure to visit the show's homepage at tgnreview.com/ADHistoryPodcast. For Paul and Patrick, thank you for listening to the AD History. We'll see you again next time in the ever-growing tapestry of world history.